There is a very real grief that comes with having prolonged concussion syndrome. Towards the end of this video, I want to talk about the stack of all the things with being ADHD and having prolonged concussion syndrome, but I do want to start with, if a neurotypical was to experience prolonged concussion syndrome, then they still would experience grief because who they were before is no longer who they are now. And whether that is result of introspection or reflection, or whether that is a thing that's manifested in front of them, is not really the only factor in the level of grief. In fact, each of those things, I think, stacks to the degree of the grief or makes up the full picture. Up. So as I talk right now, I'm mostly kind of imagining it from the lens of a neurotypical to start. Let's assume that someone was neurotypical and already had the understanding of social norms and therefore had a level of support system and grew up having a sense of understanding of how the world works and kind of flowed through it almost naturally. Let's assume that somebody had the understanding without having to constantly decode people all the time, without constantly having to study human behavior, develop that into one of their special interests, to understand society, social norms, and what people mean when they say certain things because they didn't mean what they said. Let's also assume that they had an easier time emotionally regulating themselves. Their baseline is more average. I guess let's put it that way. Their baseline is more average. Even if that is true, when you have a concussion and there's a mismatch of supply and demand for energy, all those things that was automatic for you is now still going to take more time and energy to perform, for your body to work the same way that it used to. And again, I do think that concussions and prolonged concussion syndrome is very treatable. However, the resources and accessibility to that level of information so that it's applicable for the average person who's experienced concussion is still not there. So even if all those things were true and they had quote unquote fairly normal life, even though I personally don't understand what normal is nowadays, but even if that was true, now they're going to eventually feel the grief of what once was easier is now harder. And again, while you're going through it and your body having a mismatch of the supply and demand for energy, you may or may not have the words for it right away. You may or may not have the energy to process it right away. And because life continues, people are still living their life as you reorient yourself to this new reality. There is a level of grief and feeling misunderstood, feeling like you don't belong, feeling like you lost your life, feeling like who you once were is now all of a sudden, in a quick moment, no longer who you are. That is disorienting, and it's also frustrating. In general, grief is not a linear process. Grief has its ups and downs, it ebbs and flows, and it's not necessarily always in order of all the stages of grief. In fact, you can go back and forth, and you may or may not always be grieving this thing. Now, the severity of the grief, I want to acknowledge, even for neurotypicals, can still be exacerbated by other situations, I want to acknowledge that. And none of this is meant to dismiss that. I just kind of want to paint a picture for what it may be like when your baseline changes after having a quote-unquote fairly normal baseline. Now, if you're ADHD or just autistic and just ADHD, that baseline that we start off with is very different. It is drastically different from the average baseline because our processing is already different. The input we receive is different. And all those things take up more energy already on a day-to-day. On top of that, being autistic or having ADHD is still, on average, not well understood. I'm more excited as I see more people talking about it in a way that hits home because it starts to help me have the words for my own experiences, but that is still limited. It's still not taught widely. So when you are autistic, have ADHD, or both, which having both is it's a whole experience in itself, your day-to-day could already be similar to someone who has a mismatch of energy in supply and demand because of a concussion. That is already our day-to-day, and we navigate by compensating or creating a system where we manage our energy, knowing how much it takes to recover from a thing. That's already our day-to-day. So if something takes a neurotypical with prolonged concussion syndrome, if it takes them 3 to 4 days to recover, that could be our norm already without a concussion. Now, I'm not saying that having a concussion and having ADHD and being autistic are interchangeable. That's not what I'm saying at all. Autism is not a brain injury. So I want to not trying to over-explain, but I just want to make sure that I'm not misunderstood. Oh, the irony. I'm just saying that there is already, on a biological level, our body demands more energy to have a similar output. And if that is your baseline and then have a concussion, now the gap is larger, it's bigger. Therefore, the gap of feeling misunderstood is also larger. People are still trying to catch up on educating society about neurodivergence when that social gap of understanding neurodivergence is still quite wide, and then the gap of healthcare system and medical professionals as a whole understanding the treatment for concussions is also another big gap. That are two separate things. When you combine it, now it goes into its very own category or niche, for the lack of better words, who start to connect the dots on a neurodivergence experience with prolonged concussion syndrome. And that gap increases the more specific the person's needs are, because we're never really just looking at one diagnosis. We're looking at a person with a diagnosis. And at the end of the day, it's not just the diagnoses we need to look at. We need to look at the person who's experiencing it and the whole picture that is feeding into this. When you have to navigate that and learn about what you're experiencing, especially if you're late diagnosed, you're processing the late diagnoses, you're processing your life in this new filter, and then you also have this injury that gets medically gaslit frequently and gets reduced to simply just you're anxious, or you haven't recovered from prolonged concussion syndrome because you're anxious. And I'm not even saying that that's a 100% false statement, because there is truth to it that our anxiety contributes to the delay of making progress with prolonged concussion syndrome, but it's much more nuanced than that and has a feedback loop of all the things that we don't have access to while we're navigating prolonged concussion syndrome because of the mismatch of energy levels. We have all these things that we have deemed necessary for kids to develop their brain properly, and we acknowledge that is unfair and inhumane if they don't receive those opportunities to develop their brain, and yet somehow remove those same opportunities for adults to develop their brain, but our brain is neuroplastic and can still change. Anyways, that's a whole other thing. I think the more we look at the full person in front of us, the more we can understand as a society, even if you've never had a concussion, and see that the level of grief, of being misunderstood, of feeling like you lost your life, not knowing how to get to the right resources because they're not as readily available, and then partnering it with the education on neurodivergence still in progress and in motion, and it is a stack that needs a lot of work on their own, and therefore the gap is even bigger when they're combined. It starts to kind of paint a picture of, okay, yeah, this makes sense why somebody would have injury, depression. This makes sense why someone might develop complex PTSD from the medical gaslighting and from not being understood through all these things, separate from the complex PTSD they probably had from growing up neurodivergent in a world that is not built for them. That grief, when there's no space for that, also creates more stress and also creates more anxiety. It also heightens the cortisol levels and then impacts your ability to recover from prolonged concussion syndrome. It affects your gut, and which is essentially your second brain. Therefore, your gut doesn't even have or isn't even able to support your brain, which is already the case with prolonged concussion syndrome. But this loop keeps going. My thing with this video is more so to kind of just throw out, hopefully, pieces that start to paint a picture to help people, one, understand if they've never had a concussion and or they're not neurodivergent, and two, hopefully put out something into this little corner of the internet where people who are neurodivergent and had a concussion start to feel, okay, there is somebody talking about it, because there's, from my perspective, there aren't a lot of stories that I've found to be forward about the combined experience of being neurodivergent and also having a concussion, especially in your 20s or your 30s. And me being in my 30s, that's a whole other thing too, is like there's the layer of grief of feeling like, oh, this is where I should be in my 30s. Oh, this is a year ago, my life was X, Y, and Z, and now I don't know when I'm going to get back to that. Wanting to make progress and feeling stuck. Like, there are these expectations I had in my head that I have to wrestle with and grieve as I navigate my current reality. And I don't think I'm the only one. I think there are a lot of people that are going through this too, though they may not be as vocal or they may not be online. But my hope is to share this so that if anybody is going through that combination, that stack, that you are not alone, that you can hear somebody else going through it too, that you can have company, even if it's through the internet, and know that this is something you can talk about, that you don't have to keep it all to yourself. Now, I'm not saying go online and do what I'm doing, because there's another layer to that as well that needs to be considered, and it does make you vulnerable. But I hope that this still shares the importance of actually being able to talk about it and how being able to talk about it can contribute to our healing. If you're neurodivergent and you had a concussion, I see you, I'm with you, and you're not alone. And yeah, I'll wrap it up there. If you guys enjoy this type of videos, I do have a Patreon membership where I just build my community there, and I will see you guys in the next one.